Most people have an entire range of sensations blocked. There are many very simple, non-obvious signs. There are people who always have cats and dogs gravitating around them. As a rule, they are the ones who can develop clairvoyance. There are people who are very sensitive to places. In fact, all of this has an explanation. The next sign is those who get goosebumps.
What blocks abilities?
The first thing that blocks abilities is this. People endlessly plan and calculate their lives, but unfortunately, this doesn't help them avoid mistakes. And that's because most people not only lack the skill to notice and recognize signs from the universe, but also have an entire range of sensations blocked. Sensations that could be useful and serve as a guide, helping them avoid mistakes.
Natalia, but what kind of mistakes could these be? Could you elaborate?
Often they're fatal. For example, someone goes to a store or decides to travel somewhere and ends up in an accident, losing their life, for instance, or their health. Many people say it's fate, but in reality, it's clear that they simply could have avoided it if their intuition had been working, even just a little. Or more everyday ones, like choosing a partner. People often make mistakes when choosing a partner and end up with someone completely unsuitable, who not only drains their energy and breaks their heart, but can also lead to financial losses. People invest money, supposedly in investments, but end up falling for scammers. We see situations like this every day. A person gets a job or starts a business and ends up in trouble with the law, or again, loses money. Someone starts a business partnership and the other partner betrays them. We see situations like this every day, and many mistakes end up being very, very costly.
Speaking of abilities, is this just about intuition? In general, what are these abilities? Does everyone have them, or is it something other than intuition?
Well, how are abilities generally defined in the world? The classic definition says that, in theory, everyone has abilities, but the range in which these abilities manifest is very broad. For some, it might be intuition, just a fleeting feeling, for example, a quiet little voice that says, "Don't do this," or that "this is great, this is amazing." And people often ignore it, and it's very quiet. And for some people, these abilities are highly developed. It could even be a form of flow channeling. It could also be dreams where you receive very specific and detailed hints. It could even manifest as vivid visual images in your waking life that subtly hint at upcoming significant events or provide clear and precise answers. By the way, these can also be simpler manifestations like signs. For example, repeating numbers on the clock. Very often people see them. It's actually a very popular topic on my blog. And for some, it's claircognizance. For example, for me, information comes through clearly and immediately. So I ask a question and get an answer. And also, for example, it often comes through the body. It's very common, like goosebumps. Many people say, "Oh, I have goosebumps." So goosebumps are also a kind of hint that comes through the body.
But that's a sign that everything is right, isn't it? It's a good sign for yourself.
Everyone has their own. Usually people who are more self-aware notice that yes, if they get goosebumps, it means yes, everything is right or that it's true. That's the main interpretation, but it can be individual. So you need to pay attention to how it feels for you.
And what about the déjà vu effect? I actually just experienced it recently. Is that also some kind of sign or not? Or is it just...
Well, I would say it's a sign that tells you to dig deeper, that this has happened somewhere before, right? Aren't you doing the same thing again? I would say it's a hint.
And sometimes it just happens out of nowhere, and I don't even know what kind of sign you could take from that.
Well, logically, none. But if you turn to your own abilities, to your intuition, dig deeper, ask the question, then there is definitely a hint. It's just not logical. It's not on the surface. But when we rely on logic, we're only relying on past experience, what we've had or what we've seen or what someone else has experienced. And to make the right decision, we need to rely on the future and assess how things will develop and what our choices will lead to. And for that, logic alone is not enough. Only super abilities can help here.
So how do you know if you have super abilities?
There are many very simple, non-obvious signs. I'll list a few now and let our viewers also pay attention to themselves. And if you notice these abilities in yourself, please write about it in the comments. Well, let's start with the simplest ones. Someone calls you, you haven't looked at the screen yet, but you already know who it is. It might seem like a small thing, but in reality, it's the most basic form of foresight. There's an institute like that in the US, the Institute of Noetic Sciences. They conducted a study specifically about cases involving phone calls and found that, indeed, there is such a pattern, and the probability of guessing depends on how well you know the person. If it's a stranger, of course, you'll never guess. But if it's, for example, a relative, then the probability is very high. Or someone you know very well, someone you communicate with a lot. This is explained by the presence of a telepathic channel, because people are connected by invisible energetic cords, you could say, or channels. And the more you communicate, the stronger this connection becomes. For example, if we take twins, their connection is very strong because they spent a lot of time together even in their mother's womb, and during that time their bond became very strong for life. They can feel each other's emotions and even read each other's thoughts. And they have this connection for life. And if we consider some other signs, for example, that you are thinking about someone and then quite unexpectedly this person calls you or you happen to meet him.
Yes.
Like that.
Yes.
A common situation. This is also a sign of telepathy. Because you think telepathically, you're already in contact with this person, and therefore he also has this impulse, this thought, I really need to call.
Yes.
That is, this happens unconsciously, of course, subconsciously, but such connections exist, and they are quite explainable. If we accept the fact that subtle planes exist, that there are these fine invisible threads, everything becomes clear. Then let's take some other signs. For example, there are people who often have electronics or devices break down. Their live streams constantly get interrupted. This is a sign of strong energy. And when a person has very strong energy but hasn't learned how to ground it, direct it, or generally manage it, this energy often flows chaotically. And electrical appliances are also electromagnetic fields. And basically the energy of this person and the devices or communication tools enter into such a resonance that it leads to these kinds of malfunctions. So what other signs could there be?
I can say that with the ones you've listed, I've definitely experienced them myself. I've checked them all. I wonder about our viewers. Write in the comments.
People just don't think about this. And they think, well, it's just a coincidence, no big deal. But in reality, all of this has an explanation. All right, let's move on. For example, there are people who always have cats, dogs, or little children gathering around them. And even if they don't really like animals that much, or maybe they do, it doesn't matter. It's not dependent on that. But the reason is that these people have strong energy. It's healing energy. And animals, they sense this very well. They are pure beings, pure consciousness. They don't have logic. They don't have patterns. And of course, they are drawn to such people. The same goes for little children. They haven't yet learned to rely on reason. They act more intuitively. They sense that this is a person with such strong healing energy, and they are drawn to them on an intuitive level. There are people whom others often turn to for advice, and even strangers will tell them their whole story about their dramas. These are also people with healing potential. People who have perhaps a mission or experience or a subconscious intention to help others. But often, by the way, such people become either doctors or psychologists because this intention to help guides them, and it leads them into these helping professions. These are also signs of their healing abilities. Not everyone attaches importance to dreams, but in fact, for many people, this is actually a sign of clairvoyance, because dreaming is also a form of clairvoyance. Many people receive signs specifically in their dreams. Also, many say that deceased relatives come to them in their dreams and either tell them something or show them something. And many people can also learn to interpret this. And those who are observant can even interpret them on their own. Many people see events from the near future in their dreams. This is also a very common phenomenon. And such people, as a rule, can develop clairvoyance if they want to, and they can see not only in their dreams, but also while awake.
By the way, how appropriate is it to use dream dictionaries in this case if you haven't yet learned to understand what your dream is about?
Well, I'm in favor of learning to interpret them yourself because it can be very individual. For example, I have certain signs that I've known the meaning of since childhood. It's like my own personal experience. So once I had a dream like that, I saw how it happened, I noticed it, and the next time I already knew that this probably meant that. And I have these kinds of signs, very obvious ones, even though dreams aren't really my strong suit. But my strong suit is actually the next sign, those who get goosebumps. These are people with such strong empathy that they can even feel someone else's pain through their own body. This is my most vivid ability, the one I actually started with. And by the way, these people often suffer because of this ability, because they think they're taking on someone else's pain or illness. Although, by the way, that's not actually true. If you are this kind of person, keep in mind that you are not taking it on yourself. You are simply feeling it. You feel it because you connect to the person telepathically, you sense it, but you can stop feeling it just as easily if you learn to control this ability. In other words, you can simply disconnect and stop feeling it.
Now, that would actually be very relevant because, well, I've noticed that about myself sometimes.
Empaths are generally very sensitive people. They can sense objects, they can sense spaces, they can sense people. And such people sometimes don't even like being in large gatherings. By the way, I am one of those people too. I'm very, let's say, selective about where I go. I actually live very remotely, out in nature. It's hard for me to be around a lot of people. I can handle it now, I've learned how to manage it, but it's still not the most pleasant experience for me. For me, by the way, it's actually more interesting to interact with the energy of places. By the way, it's not a very common ability, but it does exist, so I wanted to mention it. There are people who are very sensitive to places. For example, what if there's a place where it's just impossible to be? For instance, I've had situations where I simply can't stay in certain places, like a museum, a prison, or somewhere associated with genocide. I just can't be there. And on the contrary, there are good places, for example, temples. If a temple is at least 1,000 years old, whenever I go in, I always find a spot where the energy is really strong, flowing like a stream. There's always such a spot. And I travel a lot, by the way. That's one of my hobbies. I really enjoy exploring places like that, as well as studying old objects. Because when you touch very old objects, sometimes you can sense the energy and even pick up on certain things, some events that the object has been involved with. And the same goes for walls. I find it very interesting to touch the walls of old temples, wherever it's allowed. For me, it's an interesting experience, like how some people look at paintings, but I explore what comes to me, what images I receive. It's fascinating. So, if you're that kind of person, this ability to read places and objects is called vibroturgy.
I've never even heard that word before. Is it when you feel something with your hands, or does it not have to be with your hands?
Oh, it doesn't have to be.
Do you need to touch the object?
I usually need to either stand in that place, or if it's an object, to touch it. I haven't learned to do it without touching yet. But in any case, it works better with touch. Of course, you can try to tune in telepathically, but actually, that's an interesting ability. You can develop it. Finding objects and all that is based on this.
I remembered that during one of the tours of Red Square, you weren't allowed to touch the walls, but I just couldn't resist. I had to touch that wall, some very ancient church. And then images started coming to me as I imagined who might have visited there. But maybe it was just my imagination kicking in. Is it just imagination or not? How can you even tell the difference?
Personally, I believe that you should learn to trust yourself and choose to believe that it's real. Of course, supernatural abilities can't really be considered an exact way of getting information. If you really need to know something for sure, you have to compare several things. I usually double-check in different ways. With images, then I might ask a question and get an answer. I also read about a study where, in England, they used channeling, using people who can see things, to find some archaeological objects that were underground, and then they actually excavated them. So it is possible, but you have to train for it, so to speak. In my experience, the more you practice, the more accurate you become. Once in Cappadocia, we found a Templar monastery this way. There was a monastery, but it was simply marked as Christian. But when I started touching the walls, I sensed the Templars, and then I saw a symbol. Sometimes you can double-check by the symbols, because I saw an unusual cross, and then I started looking it up in the literature. Yes, that's a Templar cross. So that's how I double-checked it, through the symbol. Nowhere was it written that it was Templar, but then I told some friends who give tours that this is what it is.
Well, it's interesting, of course, to understand what blocks abilities.
Yes, I'll list some factors now, things that block abilities. The first thing that blocks abilities is emotions, especially negative emotions such as fear. I've been working for more than a year now. Well, I've personally been working in this field as a teacher for 10 years. I've been working with students for 3 years now, and I see that the main thing that blocks them is fear. That is, people with abilities have known since childhood that they have them, but they prefer to deny it, and there are reasons for that. What if people suddenly think there's something wrong with me, that I'm abnormal, that I'm crazy? What if they send me to a mental hospital? What if I start hearing voices in my head? Because there is so little information about this, and because there are such negative associations, many people prefer to reject it, to distance themselves from it, partly out of fear that they will be shunned, rejected, or considered strange. I've probably been writing about this topic since at least 2021, and in my circle, so many people have confided in me that they also have this or that and some pretty significant abilities. But they say, Natasha, you're the first person I'm telling this to. I've been afraid my whole life to talk about it, thinking people would say I'm weird or not normal. So that's the first thing. In other words, the first step is to admit to yourself that it's normal, that you can at least acknowledge to yourself for now that this exists. And the second thing that blocks it, of course, is our mind. Because we've been taught since childhood that what others tell you, what they say at school, what's written in books, what's said on TV, that's what's right. And what you think yourself, that's just your imagination. In other words, we're used to relying on others, on other people's opinions, instead of our own abilities. It's a habit. And it's a habit to devalue what you achieve with your own abilities, to think, well, someone else said this, it's scientific, and here I am. I often experience this myself, for example. Even with something as simple as traveling, for instance, what's written or what the guide says is one thing, but I see that things were actually different. But that can happen too, right? Guides aren't always right. History often gets muddled, distorted, and guides can mix things up as well. But usually people just listen to what they're told, whereas I actually try not to take guided tours, or at least I prefer that the guides don't tell me anything, because I'm more interested in what I'll feel myself, in how the place will reveal itself to me. For me, that's a completely different experience than just listening. But even if that happens, I'll still trust what I feel.
It's also about trusting yourself, of course.
Yes, it's very much about trusting yourself. Abilities are really all about trusting yourself. Because abilities are a very important part of who I am. And when I choose my abilities, I'm really choosing myself. When I choose to trust the information I receive through my abilities, it really helps me to unlock them. Because I choose it over and over again, which means I strengthen them. In other words, I'm strengthening the connection with that part of myself that's responsible for my abilities. As for what else blocks them, that, of course, is pure logic. Yes, indeed, logic, which is absolutely and fundamentally necessary for clear understanding and effective decision-making. But often, when people talk about logic, what they really mean is that they're just relying on certain patterns and it seems logical to them. Although, in reality, if you really think about it, there's a logic to superpowers as well. I don't deny logic. I'm not some spacey person. I'm actually a pretty down-to-earth entrepreneur, a manager, and I have my feet firmly on the ground. And all of my abilities, they're actually pretty logical too, at least to me. I understand where everything comes from and how it works. There's nothing I experience that I can't explain to myself. So it's like combining your own logic with your superpowers. That's what gives you this kind of super strength.
So what kinds of superpowers are there anyway? Does everyone have their own unique one, or can anyone activate all of them at once?
Well, there's actually a general definition, an internationally accepted one. Superpowers are the ability to perceive energy, to receive and transmit energy and information beyond time and space. To put it more simply, as I understand it, superpowers are the ability to interact with the subtle planes of our reality. So if we imagine that we have the material world, it is perceived through our 5 senses: sight, hearing, smell, touch, and taste. And beneath this reality, if you blur it, there are other layers that are invisible and inaudible to us. In other words, we can't perceive them with these 5 senses. Nevertheless, they exist and they can also be perceived. Usually, each physical sense is matched with a corresponding extrasensory ability. For example, vision corresponds to clairvoyance, touch to clairsentience, smell to clairalience, claircognizance, and there's even clairgustance.
I see.
When people sense certain tastes. But actually, that's not so rare. For example, if you mention a lemon, many people will already start to feel the taste of lemon.
Right.
Something like that. But there are also less obvious connections, and those occur as well. Among the most common ones, I would highlight the main ones: clairvoyance, claircognizance, and clairsentience. And usually, each person has one of these abilities that is more developed than the others. But in general, if you work on your abilities, all of them will start to develop. For example, my main abilities are clairsentience and claircognizance. But sometimes I also experience clairvoyance. So if something truly extraordinary happens, I receive images, sometimes even entire scenes or storylines that I can see. Not so often. And claircognizance and clairsentience are what I work with every day. These are, let's say, my key tools.
Well, if we take the average person nowadays, which ability is most commonly developed?
Well, most often it's intuition. I think almost everyone can find some example of that. Intuition is essentially claircognizance in its most rudimentary form. In second place, I would say, is clairsentience. Well, at least I see a lot of people who are clairsentient. And in third place is clairvoyance. So everyone who dreams dreamers, they potentially have all three of these are present. As a rule, everyone who comes to me, even for marathons, has at least one of these three.
And the most interesting thing is how you can activate them.
The first thing that's helpful is energy practices. When you start any kind of energy practice, consciously working with energy. Energy also belongs to the subtle planes, and this already sets certain processes in motion. But on the other hand, it's not guaranteed that your abilities will be revealed solely through energy practices. The second helpful thing is meditation. That is meditation, not just listening to music or following along with a video, but truly immersing yourself, exploring your inner world, and searching for answers to your own questions. This is very beneficial, and it develops the ability to pay attention to your inner world, to yourself, to your abilities. Concentration practices are also important. This is also a part of my programs. We need to develop both active and passive concentration. Active concentration is pretty straightforward. We actively focus on a particular object or question, and passive concentration is the opposite. That is, we completely relax, we stop concentrating, and we are open in that moment. In other words, we become a kind of emptiness, and we are open to receiving an answer. I also have programs where I help people unlock these abilities, because in my experience, well, there are, let's say, very gifted people, those who have truly been clairvoyant, clairsentient, or claircognizant since childhood. They are well aware of this. Usually they don't need my help. They generally manage on their own anyway. Everything is clear to them, but there aren't that many of them. There are a huge number of people who potentially have great abilities, but theirs are blocked. They're mostly blocked by fears. Or it could be that as a child, someone was born with the ability to see or sense things, and for example, their parents told them, "Why are you making things up? Why are you lying? That's nonsense." Well, that's quite common, at least I've heard it from many people. And so the child understands that they shouldn't talk about it. And in general, it's better not to see or hear any of it. So they close themselves off, or something scared them. Sometimes a person sees something and it frightens them a lot, maybe even in childhood. And they simply don't want to see any of it anymore. They say, "That's it, I don't want this." Because there's no understanding of how it works, how it's structured, and no mentor to help. That's it. Or maybe it even happened earlier, before birth, in some past lives. Well, a person could have closed off these abilities within themselves. There may have been some dramatic situations for them back then. Yes, that happens too. Yes, all sorts of things can happen. Basically, you can work with this. You can simply remove it. I have, let's say, my own techniques for how I remove it myself. And when I unblock it, the abilities open up on their own, if that's the issue. And there are also people, I can't help but mention them, in case any of them are watching us, who have experienced an out-of-body moment. This could be clinical death or even something more fleeting. Sometimes people even forget that it was some kind of brief out-of-body experience. And often, even during such a short out-of-body experience, these abilities are activated. Why does this happen? Because even for a split second, there is a separation between the physical body and the astral body of the soul. And at that moment, these abilities are activated in the soul, because these are actually the normal abilities of the soul when it is separated from the body. And often, it is precisely these people who suddenly experience a sharp awakening of abilities. They might also need help because they don't know how to deal with it. So this can also be frightening. They don't know what it is, and this kind of informational support is sometimes needed. Of course, there are people who don't have any of these abilities at all. They don't manifest. But usually these are people who have a very weak connection with themselves, with their soul. In other words, a low level of awareness. And they just haven't reached that point yet. They're simply not ready for it. That's why I don't work with such people, of course, but usually they don't come to this topic. They're not interested. They have different interests.